Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today are calendars and the Jewish New Year as it's configured today. Now, calendars in general, we always start these questions of culture with why. Why are we doing this? Why do people have calendars? Well, there's a basic natural experience that relates to calendars in most cultures, and that is observing the sky, observing the seasons, observing the stars. When do the constellations reappear? Why does the length of the day change? I mean, in our area right now in Chicago, it's dark after 7 in the morning, and it gets dark at about 6 o'clock at night, and it's only going to get worse. By the middle of winter, it'll be dark at 3 in the afternoon, and we'll be saying, what are we doing living here? So people have noticed that the days change in length, and they wonder, why does that happen? And what's the pattern for that? How can I know when it's going to be longer or shorter? Why does the moon seem to get larger and larger, and then the moon gets smaller and vanishes, and then the moon comes back again? Why does that happen? Can we use those things like the moon, like the stars, like the length of the days to count the number of days, the coming of the seasons, even tracking years? And which one should we follow? After all, one day is a sun cycle. We think of it as the sun going around, but of course it's the opposite. We're rotating the sun for a year, and we're rotating on our axis for a day. The moon cycle is a bit longer, 29 or 30 days, depending on the month. The full sun pattern of a full year is even longer, and the constellations moving from place to place can be a multi-year cycle. Halley's Comet is 78 years or something like that. So you could pick all different kinds of time measurements based on the solar and the cosmic phenomena that we can observe. And this actually has an echo in Jewish folklore as well. There's a famous town called Chelm. Chelm is known for having its people who think they're really smart, but actually are very foolish. And so in this particular case, they decided to have a debate in Chelm over which was the most important celestial body. Was the sun more important, or was the moon more important? And in the end, the wise men of Chelm decided that the moon was the more important heavenly body because the sun is out during the day when it's light out, but the moon is out at night when it's dark and you need it more. So therefore, the moon is the more important object. Of course, now we know that moonlight actually is sunlight. It's simply sunlight reflected off the moon and back to Earth. But this is the wisdom of Jewish folklore. I find in my job, I get the same question every year. When are the Jewish holidays? And I had a professor in college who would say, the Jewish holidays are the same day they are every year. Hanukkah is always on the 25th of Kislev. And Rosh Hashanah is always on the 1st of Tishrei. Well, that's one way to convey the information. But that's not so useful for people who are oriented toward the general calendar, the universal calendar, however you want to describe it. We'll talk about that in a minute. This year, our holidays were, quote, early because they were near the beginning of September for Rosh Hashanah, and Hanukkah will be near the end of November, actually, whereas Passover will actually be late because we are in a Jewish leap year this year, as I'll discuss. So when we understand not only the calendar, but also Jewish holidays, we understand that there are many layers to these holidays. Anything that evolves has different stages of development. And generally, we can understand 4 layers to Jewish holidays. The first is a pastoral or natural experience. It could be the appearance of the moon, or it could be a harvest season. You might have a winter festival, you might have a summer harvest festival. So these are part of the agricultural experience. And by the way, that could also apply to animal cycles. The birth of lambs is an agricultural moment for those who are raising animals. Then there's the biblical version of these holidays, the way that the priests who compiled the Torah decided to describe these events, or in a rare occasion, holidays that are post-Torah, like, for example, the holiday of Purim, which appears in the book of Esther. That's after the Torah was written, most likely. We'll talk about that more when we get to Purim. So there's the pastoral, natural level. There's the biblical interpretation of this observance. And then there's the rabbinic version of interpreting, which sometimes adapts both the biblical and the pastoral, natural version. And we'll see how the rabbis add their layer of interpretation and emphasis. And then finally, there's the modern experience of holidays, which is often radically revised, even how the rabbis celebrated them and what they meant by it. Our goal is to try to sift through all 4 of these layers, both to understand how the holidays evolve, but also to find inspiration. We may find that the pastoral version of the holiday is really more interesting to us than the rabbinic version of the holiday. Or we might find the biblical version has some insight that we can draw on. So we don't have to only use the rabbinic version and respond to that. We can also dig back to those earlier layers. And this layering approach also applies to the calendar as a whole. So when you're deciding how to make your calendar based on phenomena in the world, you have basically four options. You could go by the seasons, you could go by the sun, you could go by the moon, or you could try to combine the moon and the sun in some way. And so we'll talk about each of those options. So the first one I mentioned is a seasonal calendar, where honestly, it doesn't really matter exactly what day it is. It's just what the season is. Is it getting warmer? Is it really hot? Is it getting cooler? Is it raining time? Or raining time in the Middle East? Is it snow time in our northern hemisphere? So that is the seasonal calendar, where you'd have a spring holiday, a summer holiday, a fall holiday. You might not even have a winter holiday because that's sort of the be indoors time. It doesn't matter what day it is. I sometimes jokingly call this calendar the retirement calendar, where it doesn't matter what day it is, it matters what the weather is and what the season is. That decides what you can do. So this was actually part of a Jewish calendar as well. I'm going to pull up a version of the Jewish calendar that's in Deuteronomy chapter 16. Hopefully you can see that. So in Deuteronomy 16, we have a description of the three major harvest festivals. So this describes how you have different festivals to the god around the harvest season. We start in verse 1. Observe the month of Aviv, Chodesh Aviv. Now, Aviv just means spring, like Tel Aviv. And it doesn't tell you exactly what day. It just says observe that month. Now, later on, sometimes it gets to specific days, but in this case, it's just talking about the Passover sacrifice. Do not eat any leavened bread with it for 7 days. You eat matzot. For 7 days, there's no leaven to be found. You have to do the Passover sacrifice exactly where Yahweh told you. You cook it and eat it where he will choose. After you've done unleavened bread for 6 days, and then you count off 7 weeks. You count off 7 weeks from the sickle being first cut to the grain, and you observe the Chag Shavuot, the festival of Shavuot means weeks, literally. This is also sometimes called Pentecost, because it's 50 days. 49, 7 weeks is 7 times 7 is 50 days. On the 50th day, you observe this special event. You rejoice and you celebrate. And then after the ingathering from your threshing floor and your vat, this is the fall, you observe the Chag HaSukkot, the festival of booths, or tabernacles is the old English way to say it. You rejoice in your festival for the fall harvest. You hold that for 7 days. In fact, we just finished Sukkot. And then the summary verse in verse 16, Shalosh pamim b'shana yira'eh kol zeforcha et b'nei Yahweh Elohecha. So 3 times a year. Now this verb is an interesting one because it looks like, if you read it without vowels, 3 times a year your males will see the face of God. But you're not supposed to be able to see the face of God according to later theologies. So they revoweled it to a passive verb form. So now it is, will be seeing all your males the face of God. Well, the telltale sign is this little word here, et, which is a direct object marker in Hebrew. So when I open the door, I open et the door. It just means it's a direct object. So in this case, the direct object of the sentence is the face of God. That's what's being seen. You will see the object, the face of God. But when they revoweled it, now the et doesn't make sense, but they can't go back and like white out the consonants from the Holy Scroll. So they're sort of stuck with this ambiguity here, where a more simple reading of the text just based on the consonants, which is the older version, the vowels aren't formally added until the 8th, 9th century of the Common Era. Well, it makes more sense to say you will see the face of God. At least that might be what earlier versions thought. But the key point here is there are 3 times a year, 3 major festivals. The Feast of Matzot, that's in the spring. The Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, which is in the summer, 50 days later. And the Feast of Booths, Sukkot, in the fall. Those times, all your males appear before Yahweh, and they have to offer special gifts and so on. So this is the seasonal calendar. You'll notice it didn't mention at any point on the 5th day of this month, it was just seasonal, right? So that was one option. And you'll notice there's a lot of holidays missing from that list, right? There's no Rosh Hashanah. There's no Yom Kippur. There's no Hanukkah, because of course that's way post-Torah. There's no Purim, that's also post-Torah. There's no Israeli Independence Day, but we know that's way post-Bible. No Holocaust Memorial Day in advance, right? Okay. Although actually the Hebrew word for Holocaust, Shoah, does appear in the book of Job. So but it was a term that the modern Hebrew borrowed from the biblical book of Job, but not the other way around. There's another quirk like that where in Ezekiel's chariot, where he has this vision of this beautiful, brilliant chariot with all this light flashing around it, it says it's surrounded by chashmal, which means like a brilliant kind of electrum. You'll often see translated, but in modern Hebrew, chashmal means electricity. So you could be a modern Hebrew reader reading that book and say, and then he had a solar powered chariot? What's going on here? Well, that's again, we're projecting back. Okay, so the point here is you have this seasonal calendar, which is just based on spring, summer, fall. And the days don't matter specifically. In fact, it said count 7 weeks. It didn't say from when. Just said start counting 7. Maybe from when you do the Passover, I don't know. Maybe from when those 7 days are over. It doesn't say when the 7 days start. Again, the days don't matter. It's seasonal. Now, a second option I mentioned the seasonal first, is to do a solar calendar, where you want the calendar to match the sun cycle so that your equinoxes and your solstices are always on the same day. So that will basically give you 4 seasons of about 90 days each, plus or minus 1 or 2, because the solar cycle is 365 days, except it's not exactly 365 days. And so initially, the Romans created a Julian calendar based on Julius Caesar that was 365 days, but every 4 years, you would add a leap day. And therefore, you would match up your calendar and you would be fine, except the solar year is not 365.25 days. It is 365.22 and change days. So after several centuries, the equinoxes and the solstices were getting off the correct dates because of that little small hundredth of a decimal place error. So then, and I believe the 1600s, I'd have to look it up, Pope Gregory instituted a new calendar called the Gregorian calendar, which has a slightly different adjustment. So he jumped forward about 10 days and to catch up. And then they have new rules now where you have a leap year if it's every 4 years, except if it's divisible by 100. So an even 100 divisible year like 1900 was not a leap year. However, if it's divisible by 400, then it is a leap year again. So the year 2000 was a leap year. It would have been disqualified by the 100s, but it was requalified by the 400s. And that adjustment has kept us more or less on target. It has also led to a split between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, because the Eastern Orthodox Church, my understanding, is still using the Julian calendar.
Yeah, that's why they have that. That's why the October Revolution was not really
right.
October Revolution.
Exactly. The Bolshevik Revolution is sometimes called the October, sometimes called the November Revolution because of which calendar you're using. Exactly.
What's interesting is if you go to cemeteries in New England, they often have a double date because they have both the Julian date and the Gregorian date.
Right. In fact, I think Benjamin Franklin was alive when this happened, and he was writing his Poor Richard's Almanac and running a newspaper, and he wrote some amusing comments about what it was like to lose 10 days of his life. When, of course, when the Pope decided to do it, that doesn't mean the English agreed with it. It took them another 150 years to finally acquiesce that they had to do what those papists wanted them to do. Okay, so when you have a purely solar calendar, it's not necessarily tied to the moon, right? It could be, the full moon can show up more than once in a month. We have this concept in English called a blue moon, where you've had 2 full moons in 1 month. That's understood. It's certainly possible. The month has nothing to do with the moon necessarily. And what's interesting is in Jewish life, centuries before the Julian or Gregorian calendars, there was a version of a calendar based on the solar year. If you read the Book of Jubilees, which was preserved in some outlying branches of the Christian church, but also was a core document for the Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran near the Dead Sea, the Book of Jubilees describes a calendar actually based on the number 7. But as you'll see, the number 7 connects them to the sun. So they love the idea of Shavuot. Remember, you count 7 cycles of 7 days and you have a 50th day. Well, what if you do 7 cycles of 7 by 7? So you get 50 times 7 is 350. Then you have a spring harvest festival of 7 days, a fall harvest festival of 7 days, and a Day of Atonement / New Year. That gets you 350 plus 7 plus 7 plus 1 is 365. Exactly. And you can make sure all your holidays are on a Sunday and not on Shabbat, so you never have a conflict. And it's called the Jubilee calendar because if you remember some of the legislation in the Torah that talks about the Jubilee year on the 50th year where you release all the debts and free all the slaves and all the land goes back to its ancestral owners, that's the Jubilee year. So the Jubilee calendar loved that idea of the 7 by 7 and the 50 years, and so they made the whole calendar based on that. It's pure numbers. It has nothing to do with celestial phenomenon. Again, the full moon doesn't matter at all. It's making sure you're on that 365 year. Now, this was really the path not taken by mainstream Jewish life, other than Shavuot. We still have Shavuot, and we still have the week. We still have Shabbat every 7 days. Now, a third option is to do a purely lunar calendar. So not a sun-based calendar and not a seasonal calendar, but one based only on the moon cycle. So every month is a month. You always have a new moon to mark the beginning of the month. And so it's 29 or 30 days because the lunar cycle is about 29 and a half days. And if you have 12 lunar months of either 29 or 30 days, you get to 354 days in a year. And there is a calendar that does run like this. It's called the Islamic calendar. That is a purely lunar calendar that only relies on the moon. In fact, it can make it hard to schedule the Eid al-Fitr feast because they won't declare the month until they see the new moon in Mecca, and they're not willing to use only math to do it. And so modernized Muslims are somewhat annoyed at that traditionalism. But the point is also that there's no seasonal connection. So you could have Ramadan in the summer, you could have Ramadan in the winter. It doesn't matter because it's not a harvest holiday. It would be weird if we had the spring harvest holiday of Passover showing up in the fall or in the winter. That wouldn't make any sense. But my joke version of this is that the seasons in Saudi Arabia are basically hot and sandy, hotter and sandy, and hot and sandy. So it doesn't matter what season the events show up. A purely lunar calendar was also a possibility. That was not the calendar the Jews chose. In the end, the Jews settled on something called a Luni-solar calendar. The Luni is L-U-N-I, not L-O-O-N-E-Y. The Luni-solar calendar means it's a combination of the moon and the sun. So the months are defined by the moon. Every Jewish month begins on a new moon, and the 15th of every Jewish month is a full moon, always. So if you see a full moon, you know it's the 15th of some month. You might not know what month it is, but you'll know it's the 15th of a Jewish month. And then to keep it even, because you're losing 10 or 11 days a year, 354 days, you're losing 10 days to the sun every year. Every 2 or 3 years, they add an extra month of Adar, which is the sort of spring month where Purim takes place. Usually it's like February, March. So every 2 to 3 years, or technically it's 7 out of 19 years, they have a leap Adar, a second Adar, and that keeps the seasonal events in season. So that's why Jewish calendar dates in the general calendar move back 10 days and 10 days, then jump forward 20 days and 10 days and jump forward 20 days. So it's all this readjustment by adding a whole leap month. This year is going to be a leap year in the Jewish calendar, so we will be adding a second Adar in the spring, and that's why Hanukkah is going to be early, and then you'll hit the leap month, and so Passover will be much later.
How long is the second Adar?
It's the same as the first Adar, which is going to be 29 or 30 days, depending on the moon cycle. It's a full month. You add a full month, those extra years. So on a regular year, it's 353, 354, 355 days, depending on how they juggle the 29s and the 30s. But in a leap year, it's 380 days, 383 days, because they've added a full leap month. But that does keep the seasons on cycle. And it's also interesting that the moon is often tied to Jewish festivals. Not every Jewish holiday is on the 15th of a month, but a lot of them are. So Sukkot begins on the 15th of a Jewish month. Tu B'Shvat is on the 15th of a Jewish month. Purim is on the 14th of a Jewish month. Passover begins on the evening of the 14th, beginning of the 15th of a Jewish month. So it shows up a lot that we're doing these full moon events on a full moon. And there's some speculation that Hanukkah also has some moon connection because it's one of the darkest nights of the year, because it's near the end of a moon cycle. It's on the 25th of a Jewish month. So it's about as far as you get away from a new moon at the darkest time of the year, near the end of the solar year. So that puts it as one of the darkest nights. And this gets back to that Chelm debate over which is the more important solar body, celestial body, because when do Jewish holidays start? They start at night. What defines the month? The moon. In fact, the word for month in Hebrew is chodesh, which is related to the word for chadash, new. So every Jewish month is the new. It's the new moon. And so the moon is in many ways defining Jewish time based on that counting. You might even remember in the Genesis creation story, after each day, what does it say? There was evening and there was morning, day 4, day 5. Again, the evening coming first is marking the beginning of time. I mean, after all, our version of counting time from midnight is totally arbitrary. We could count it from daybreak, we can count it from sundown, and so the Jews counted it from sundown. So we're going to take a look at another version of a Jewish calendar. This is from the book of Leviticus, and this is more complete. This is sort of the final version of the priestly calendar that includes all the holidays the priests felt were important to observe. And we'll see more of the ones we're familiar with, framed differently. But as we read through this, keep an eye on what's missing, but also what's different about this calendar from the Jewish calendar we're familiar with. So this is Leviticus 23, starting in verse 2. These are my fixed times, the fixed times of Yahweh. On 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there's a Sabbath of complete rest. So here we have Shabbat defined as a holiday right at the beginning of the calendar. And then here are the sacred occasions. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, there'll be a Passover offering to Yahweh. And on the 15th of that month, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So here you have the Pesach, it's actually in the Hebrew, and then you Chag HaMatzot, the festival of the unleavened bread. You eat unleavened bread for 7 days. On the first day, you have a special occasion. That's the first night Seder. On the 7th day, you also have a special occasion. So there's Passover defined. However, you might notice in the first month, when is the Jewish New Year now? Is it in the spring? No, it is in the fall. But you'll also notice this calendar is more detailed. It has a numbering of months. It has a special day on the month. So this is not the seasonal, whenever you get around to a calendar. This is a much more organized and specific calendar. Then it goes on to say, when you enter the land, you bring the first fruit of your harvest, and you elevate that omer, that sheaf, to Yahweh, and a special offering as well. And from the day on which you bring the elevation of the sheaf offering, the day after the Sabbath, you count off 7 weeks. 7 weeks complete until the day after the 7th week, 50 days, and then you bring an offering of new grapes. So there you have weeks again, Shavuot, that summer harvest holiday, the first fruits holiday, and special offerings as well. You offer a he-goat as a sin offering and 2 yearling lambs, and so on. So now, and that same day you have a special celebration. And when you harvest, leave the corners of your field, and so there's a nice sort of ethical lesson there too. And now in verse 23, we have, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you observe a complete rest, a sacred occasion commemorated with loud blasts. And the Hebrew is Shabbaton Zichron Teruah. Recognize that word Teruah? It's one of the sounds we call to the shofar. Teruah. In fact, the verb for to sound a shofar is litkoa b'shofar, which literally means make a tekiah on the shofar. Tekiah. This is one of the verbs. It's a memorial of that kind of a sound on the shofar with loud blasts. Do not do any work. And mark, the 10th of the 7th month is Yom HaKippurim, literally the Day of Atonements, plural, but it sounds like Yom Kippur. Right? It's a sacred occasion to you. You will practice self-denial. Literally in the Hebrew it says, V'initem et nafshotechem. You will afflict your souls, whatever that means. And then bring an offering by fire to Yahweh. You do no work on that day. It is a day of atonement, on which atonement is made on your behalf before Yahweh your God. Any person who does not practice self-denial or afflict their souls shall be cut off from his kin. Whoever does work that day will cause them to perish. And that's why Sandy Koufax did not pitch before. He pitched on Rosh Hashanah. Or at least Hank Greenberg played a World Series game on Rosh Hashanah, which is just a series.
Pitch on Saturday.
What?
Koufax did not pitch on Saturday.
Never on a Saturday? I don't think that's true at all. Well, that's a Googleable detail. But I think he played on Saturdays. He played on Rosh Hashanah. But Yom Kippur, I mean, the precedent had been Hank Greenberg, who in the 1930s also was faced with this dilemma for World Series days. and he got a rabbi's opinion to say it's okay to play on Rosh Hashanah, but not on Yom Kippur. Okay. Because in the Bible, clearly Yom Kippur is the big day, right? It's very, very important. Afflict yourself, it says twice, whoever does any work will be cut off. Do not do any work whatsoever. It's a law for all time, everywhere. None of the other rules have this kind of stringency to it. It's that serious. The Sabbath of complete rest. On the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening to evening, you observe your Sabbath. And then on the 15th day of this month, so just 5 days later, you have the Chag HaSukkot, the Feast of Booths. That's Sukkot, right? For 7 days. The first day is a special occasion. You have 7 days of offerings by fire. And these are the set times, and it goes on to describe Sukkot again a little bit further in that version. So what you can notice about that calendar is you have different holidays described differently. So what are some of the details that jump out at you as different from the Jewish calendar as we understand it today?
Well, the months are not right.
Okay, so the months are off. What is this? Spring is the first month and the Day of Atonement happening in the 7th month. How does that happen?
Now, this is the priestly voice.
This is the priestly version of the calendar, which is sort of the final editors of the Torah who are imposing their system around 500 BCE, but it's running from about 500 BCE till about 70 of the Common Era. They're able to exert their authority then. You'll also notice, by the way, that holiday, the day of Teruah, the sound, it's not called Rosh Hashanah because it's not the beginning of the year. Rosh Hashanah literally means head of the year, so it would make sense to call it that when it is, but if it's not, then it's just the warm-up to the Day of Atonement. The other things, someone has Googled it for us. According to ESPN, Koufax picked on Fridays and Saturdays, but not on the first day of Passover beside Yom Kippur. So he missed first day of Passover and he missed Yom Kippur. Thank you, research assistant.
Taking to work later.
Hey, right, instant results. Next time I'll say, hey Siri, and someone will. Okay, so yes, we don't have the New Year where we have it in the Jewish calendar now. And we also don't have, again, holidays like Hanukkah and Purim. Those haven't been invented yet. And the holidays are described differently. You might also notice Shavuot is still a bit ambiguous because it says count 7 weeks from the Sabbath. What's Sabbath? So there was actually a debate in Jewish circles over, do you count that from the beginning of Passover, which is like a Sabbath, or do you count it from the Sabbath that's during the week of Passover? Because there's always going to be a Saturday in that 7-day period. And one group chose the Saturday during because they were more literalists. The others were more figurative. They chose the first day of Passover as the first night of counting the Omer, counting the 50 days to the Shavuot. That's the practice that's followed today in Rabbinic Judaism. But there was a debate at one time over which way to do it.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
We may not know the answer to this, but it seems, why did they pick that particular time for the Day of Atonement? Is there some reason for that? And it's so close to Sukkot, it seems that.
Well, the Sukkot is sort of like the first kid when you've had 3 or 4 more kids, like they're sort of forgotten sometimes. It's so old that it got superseded by this Day of Atonement. Because again, if you're a priest, you traffic in guilt, right? That is your currency. The basis of your power is people need to come to you to offer atonement and sacrifice. And of course, you get a piece of the offerings, and there's animal offerings, you get the meat. I mean, this is your business. So that's one of the reasons that the priest designed the calendar with a holiday every 7 days. Not once a season, once every 7 days, you got to show up and give me a special sacrifice. So a Day of Atonement is very important to them. It reaffirms their power. And it happens to be in the very middle of the calendar. Because if you've got a set 12-month calendar and you count 6 months is about half the year, so 178 days, it's 354, 177 days or so would be the middle point. So if you counted 6 months of 29 or 30, that would be 180 plus 177 is 157. Then you add 10 days, you're right about at the middle point of the calendar. So you're pretty close to the midpoint of the calendar. So when does it make sense to have your atonement day? Does it make sense to have it at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year, or as like a midterm evaluation where you get to correct course for the rest of the calendar year before you get to the spring again. The other reason why it makes sense to have a Day of Atonement, a Day of Judgment, a Day of Awe in that season has to do with the seasons in the land of Israel, because that is basically just before the rainy season starts. And the rainy season is absolutely going to define who will live and who will die and who by fire. And, I mean, it's life and death, whether the rains come too much or too little and for the right crops. So it made sense, again, to get your slate clean before the God is judging what the harvest is going to be and how let's get everything cleaned up before we get that point. So the calendar that we have today for the Hebrews, by the way, was not purely invented by them. It's actually based on the Babylonian calendar. We found examples of this dating back to 2000 BCE, so well before the Torah was put together. In the Babylonian calendar, the first month is in the spring. It's called Nisanu. The seventh month is called Tishritum, which in the Bible is called Etanim. The winter months are Kislimu, like Kislev, Tebetum, like Tevet, Shabbatu, Shvat, Adar. In the spring is Adar in the Babylonian calendar. So this is why the Torah calendar starts in the spring and came back with them from the Babylonian exile. They're borrowing the Babylonian calendar. I mean, there's even a quirky holiday that we'll talk about when we talk about fasts and minor festivals called Tammuz. There's a fast of Tammuz, which is based on the Babylonian god Dumuzi, who dies in a conflict of the gods, and the women bewail Dumuzi. And the date of the Jewish fast is the exact date on the Babylonian calendar when the Babylonians were bewailing the death of Dumuzi. So they even had the name of a Babylonian god in the Jewish calendar because they borrowed it from the Babylonians. Because the Babylonians are gone, we forgot that we borrowed it from them, and now it's just Jewish. So this is the quirk of this calendar. We're the only ones still following the Babylonian calendar, and we don't even call it the Babylonian calendar. We call it the Hebrew calendar. Okay, but generally, when the Bible's listing months, it just says first month, second month, seventh month. And by the way, there are some Christian sects that won't use days of the week for a similar reason, because they're all Norse gods. You've got Thor's day and Odin's day and Freya's day and then Saturn's day. Okay, so because they were God's names, some Christian sects will just say first day, second day, third day. And actually, in modern Hebrew, it's the same thing. You just say Yom Rishon, Yom Shini, first day, second day, except for Shabbat is Shabbat. That has a name, but otherwise it's first day, second day. So that's the Jewish calendar in a quick overview. Any comments, questions, or details on that before we move to talk about the high holidays specifically? Finally, all makes sense now?
Well, a lot of it, yeah. But then are you going to talk with the rabbis and why they changed it?
Well, the rabbis, what the rabbis did basically was they adjusted the new year to the fall. They shifted the new year, but they basically kept accounting the way the priests had put it up. They added some new holidays, some fast days. Some of those are described in the Hebrew Bible and the books of the prophets, where they describe this destruction or that destruction. There's one passage that says there's a fast in the first month, and the third month, and the seventh month. So then they assigned what those fast days would be, even if the prophet talking about it was general about what month it was in. They picked a specific date to put it on. The holidays of Hanukkah, post-biblical holidays, Purim, which is almost post-biblical because the book is so late, those are defined by the rabbis more clearly. And then they also, of course, add their layer of interpretation to the holidays. So now, as we'll see, the new year becomes something different. It's not just, well, first of all, it's not just the Day of Atonement with a 10-day preview with some shofars. Now it becomes the new year, and it becomes not just a time of judgment, but it's actually an echo of creation itself. So there's really two Jewish innovations in the calendar that they shifted from the Babylonians. They moved the new year to the fall, even though it's still a luni-solar calendar, and they added this holiday called Shabbat. There's nothing, there's an event called Shabbatum in the Babylonian ritual calendar, which is a day of stopping everything, except it was once a month. And it was close to the full moon. So it was a very different approach, and it was not based on counting seven no matter what. Because Shabbat moves through the seasons, it moves through the cycle of the moon, it doesn't matter. Because remember, the cycle of the moon is not evenly 28 days, 29 or 30. So Shabbat, really running it by numbers without any calendar, was a real innovation. During the Roman period, actually, the Greeks and Romans thought the Jews were lazy because they insisted on a day off every 7 days, where the Greco-Roman calendar was a day off every 9 days. And actually, when the French Revolution calendar tried to impose a metric calendar of 10-day weeks, they couldn't make it fly because, again, who wants to work 9 days before you get a day off.